right, welcome back, students. We're going to talk about Chapter 20, Part 2 now. And this is focusing specifically on the start of the Great Depression and the causes of the Great Depression. So what causes the Depression and why does it get so bad? Hopefully that are the two questions that will be answered by this lecture. So here we have the key terms. We're going to talk about the election of 1928, which is when Herbert Hoover will become the president. And then he is very unfortunate that just 7 months later, the stock market crashes in October of 1929 and the Depression begins. And the rest of the lecture is really talking about these various government reactions to the stock market crash of 1929 and why the Depression became as severe as it was. So here is an image of a billboard that you would have seen a lot during the Great Depression. It reads, "Jobless men, keep going, we can't take care of our own." And it was typically sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce of various towns throughout the country to, remind these roving groups of jobless, job-seeking, mostly young men, that they don't have any jobs and that they should just keep going. And this was a very common thing throughout the U.S. If you link to this YouTube link, you will be able to listen to a very popular song during this time period, "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" And the version I have linked here is the one sung by Bing Crosby. Okay, so let's talk about the U.S. on the eve of the Great Depression, just as a reminder where we're at. So last lecture we talked about this division that's happening in the United States between conservative and modern forces. We also have the fact that a lot of people going into the Great Depression are in debt, right? Because there was this big push to consume throughout the 1920s. And people are living above and beyond their means, and they're putting things on credit. And this is a very dangerous situation and causes the economy to collapse even quicker than it would have under normal circumstances. Prohibition is still alive and well on the eve of the Great Depression, right? Even though, of course, there are a lot of people breaking the laws around prohibition and finding ways around it. You have a whole generation of lawbreakers, and you see this increase in organized crime, but prohibition is still alive and well in 1929. And then, of course, the government is a very hands-off. The federal government at this particular time in U.S. history is a very hands-off government, and it continues to favor business over labor interests. So we talked about labor strikes and labor movements in the United States. There really hasn't been much traction in terms of labor and labor rights and laws protecting workers in the United States. And of course, we're going to start to see, last lecture I talked about that drop off in consumption that begins right around 1925. Well, that will result in unemployment increasing over that time period as well. And again, these were all indicators early on that a depression was imminent, but all of those indicators were being ignored. And the gaps between the rich and the poor are getting wider and wider. And this is important because the United States is a consumer society. The health of the economy is based on the confidence of consumers. And so if you don't have money, you cannot go out and spend money, and then that creates problems for the economy. So in 1928, there is a presidential election. The Republicans are going to nominate Herbert Hoover as their candidate, and Alfred Smith is going to be the Democratic candidate. One of the biggest campaign issues in the election of 1928 is the issues around prohibition. Herbert Hoover was known as the dry candidate. He was in favor of maintaining prohibition. Alfred Smith, on the other hand, wanted to see an end and a repeal to prohibition. Alfred Smith was also the first Catholic to run for president. For Herbert Hoover's vice president, he chooses a man by the name of Charles Curtis, who is a Native American, actually grew up on a Native American reservation, was raised by his grandparents. And so that's kind of an interesting, just little side note. Herbert Hoover was seen as a liberal Republican. He was seen as somebody who was very much in favor of a hands-off, laissez-faire economy. He was very staunch in his belief that economies might go through hard times, but that they will sort of self-correct through time if you give it time. And that's kind of a dangerous mentality to have going into this depression, because this depression is so severe that it really did require a response by government. So he was very hesitant at first to respond to the problems that the depression is going to cause American society. He was very optimistic, and he was known to say during his campaign, "a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage." And that was sort of his like motto, you know. And so you get a real sense from him that he has like this unwavering sort of optimism about the future and about the economy in the United States. You see here the electoral map. You can see that he won by a very, very large margin. So Herbert Hoover is an interesting historical character. He was born, actually the first president of the United States to be born west of the Mississippi. He was born in Iowa, which is, I know, just a little bit west of the Mississippi, but whatever, we'll give it to him. And he's orphaned at an early age, and he ends up being sent out to Oregon, where he is raised by his uncle. And his uncle was a Quaker, and believed very strongly in pacifism and sort of gender equality and those types of very characteristic types of Quaker beliefs. And so that really did shape Herbert Hoover as a young man. He'll grow up and be part of the first graduating class of Stanford University here in California, in Palo Alto. And he studies mining engineering and is a very successful mining engineer at a very early age. He actually, after he graduates from Stanford, moves to China to consult in these big American mining operations that were happening in China around 1900. And he brings his wife with him to China, and they both learn how to speak Mandarin. So they knew how to speak Mandarin to each other, and they would sometimes do that in the White House when they didn't want other people to know what they were saying. But he has this very strong belief, as I mentioned in the last slide, of this idea of laissez-faire capitalism, of small government, and that basically economies need to run their course. So that his hesitation there in responding to the Great Depression, unfortunately, will be his legacy, and a lot of what he did accomplish in his political career, and especially in his earlier political career, like during World War I, where he was the Food Administration supervisor. He was very successful in a distribution of food during World War I. In fact, that's really sort of where he gets notoriety as a politician. A lot of those things are kind of overlooked in his legacy because he turns out to be the president when the Great Depression breaks out. Okay, so just 7 months after Herbert Hoover takes office, the stock market is going to crash in an event known as Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. At the time, about 2% of private citizens owned stock. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it was a lot more than had previously owned stock because there was this huge surge of investing in the stock market in the 1920s. That being said, it will take a little while for this stock market crash to reverberate out and impact the general population. But it will happen. It will happen fairly rapidly. Within about a year's time, people are really going to start to see the impact of it. So this slide answers the question, why do we call the Great Depression great, right? Why is it known as the Great Depression? In fact, prior to this depression of the 1930s, the Depression of 1893 was called the Great Depression. So what makes this one the real Great Depression is, first off, the length of the Depression. If you look at the dates, it's 1929 to 1941, which is basically marking the entrance of the United States into World War II. The other reason why this is a Great Depression is the fact that it is a worldwide phenomenon. So it's not just happening in the United States. It's hitting industrialized countries all across the globe. So places in Europe, Germany especially, Japan will be hit by the Great Depression, right? So and because economies had become so intertwined by the time that this depression hits, it really is going to have an impact worldwide. We talked about the Dawes Plan in the last lecture, and that again creates this interdependency, this economic interdependency between the United States and Germany. So when U.S. economy collapses, the German economy is going to collapse soon after. Crop prices will be at an all-time low during the Great Depression. They declined by 60%. They had already been in decline up until that point because after World War I, there was this there was a big sort of decline in production because during World War I, the United States was the primary producer of food, not just for our country, but also for the countries at war. So after the war, there's this big decline in production, and so crop prices did decline during the 1920s, but they decline even more during the 1930s, and this is horrible, obviously, for farmers. Unemployment in manufacturing sectors is going to rise to about 25%. That's an average in the U.S. In parts of the country during the Great Depression, unemployment went as high as 60% at certain times. So, you know, certain locations were dealing with higher rates of unemployment, but the average across the U.S. was 25%. In other parts of the world, like Germany, you're going to see unemployment rates as high as 33%. So it was really very severe. And of course, during this time period, there was no social safety nets at all for people in order to, you know, mitigate the effects of the Great Depression and high unemployment rates. So there are a lot of theories about why the Depression happened. We're going to talk about what some of those are in this lecture. We're going to talk about the underlying causes, but also the responses that the government had that really didn't help the matter, and in fact, in many cases, made it much, much worse. All right, so one of the major causes of the Great Depression is this huge amount of stock market buying and trading that was happening in the 1920s. And companies were basically being overvalued, and people were, you know, kept on having optimism in the market. And there was a very dangerous practice that was being done during that time period, and that was called buying on the margin. This is when you basically you put down money on the stock. So you might only pay for 10% of the stock, and then you borrow the rest, and you you do it because you think that that stock is going to increase in value. So this was a very common practice during the 1920s. And so when the stock market does crash, it crashes much faster because a lot of that stock had actually been bought on the margin. So this is really going to impact the banks, for example. And the banks are going to lose huge amounts of money, which of course is going to impact the general population because the banks at this time don't have any insurance. So if the banks run out of money, then they don't have your money for you. And we're going to talk about that later on in the lecture. So what I encourage you to do now is to click on the YouTube link, and it will take you to I think it's about a 7-minute just sort of overview of the start of the Great Depression and also some of the underlying causes and factors and some of the government's reactions. So it's actually all stuff in the video that we're going to be talking about in lecture, but it's just a good way to kind of get an overview of what we'll be talking about and also to see some cool visual and moving images. Okay, so one of the things that is going to make the Depression severe right off the bat is the reaction that the Federal Reserve has to the Depression. It basically, okay, first let's answer the question, what is the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve is best understood as a banker's bank. In other words, the Federal Reserve is the one that the banks go to get their money that they then turn around and lend to us, the average consumer, right? And so the Federal Reserve is really important for sort of managing the economy because it sets the interest rates. So what it does is it gives the banks an interest rate, and then that interest rate gets passed on to the consumer. The other thing that's really important that the Federal Reserve Board does is it controls how much currency is in circulation. So what the Federal Reserve Board does when the Great Depression breaks out is the exact opposite of what you're supposed to do during a financial crisis. It decides to tighten up its monetary policies. So it puts less money out into circulation and it raises the interest rates and sort of tightens up on its requirements for lending money. And this happens throughout 1930 and 1931. And the end result is that it actually makes the crisis worse. And it also will hurt our the borrowers, the people who are borrowing money from the country like Germany and Austria. So what happened? So basically they had never experienced anything like this before. The Federal Reserve is a relatively new institution at this time. It had only been in place since 1916. So it did what probably you would normally do under a circumstance where you were dealing with financial crisis, is that you stop spending, right? But in fact, for the Federal Reserve, this is the exact opposite of what you're supposed to do. Instead, what you should do is you should lower interest rates so that money becomes more available. So you want to make money more available so that consumers can go out and spend that money. But that's not what they did in the 1930s. They did do that in 2008. When there was that big financial crisis, the Federal Reserve at that time was headed up, the chairman of the Federal Reserve was a man by the name of Ben Bernanke, who had basically studied this phenomenon that took place during the Great Depression, and so he knew exactly what not to do in 2008. And so in 2008, the Fed, as it's often referred to as, the Federal Reserve Board, basically lowered the interest rates and made money more available, which really helped save the economy. Okay, another issue that the economy is having to deal with is the inflexibility of the gold standard. So basically, the gold standard, the United States was on the gold standard when the country went into a depression in 1929. What is a gold standard? A gold standard is when you cannot have more money in circulation than you have in gold reserves. So in other words, for all the currency that is out in circulation, there has to be gold reserves backing it up. This is of course going to make it very inflexible, so that even if you wanted to print more money, put more money into circulation, you were tied by the fact that you had to tie it to the amount of gold reserves that you have. So basically what's going to happen is over the course of the Depression, the United States is essentially going to go off and move away from the gold standard. Most of it is abandoned by 1933. The other thing that happens during the Great Depression is that citizens are ordered actually to turn in any gold coins or any kind of gold that they have, and to the government, and then of course they would be given the exchange value for it in currency. But because that happened, for people that decided to go ahead and do it, those coins then were melted down. And so if you're a coin collector and you're looking for coins prior to the Great Depression, gold coins in particular, they're very rare and difficult to find. Okay, another major problem going into the Great Depression, and this was something that was beginning to happen in the mid-1920s, as I've already mentioned, is this gap between the rich and the poor. The rich will become very rich in the 1920s, and Calvin Coolidge, who is a president during the 20s, he actually helps make them even richer by giving tax breaks to a lot of the rich. But the problem is that there are not enough rich people to uphold the American economy. You need to have middle income, low income people going out and buying things. And so what happens is when consumption begins to slow in 1925, there just simply aren't enough people out there to go out and spend money. And the rich people are not spending, there's not enough rich people to uplift the economy. So that becomes a real issue, and it contributes to the very sharp decline in stock prices, which of course is what leads to the stock panic and sell-offs that lead to the stock market crash. Okay, so Hoover is stuck with this financial crisis, and he is being advised by some of his top advisors, including his Secretary of Treasury, to basically allow this to run its course. There's this sort of Darwinian idea that, well, the weak banks will die, but the strong banks will survive, that kind of thing. But Hoover doesn't necessarily want to do that. He wants to take a more hands-on approach. And so he does create a couple of programs to try to mitigate the effects of the Great Depression. The first is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was basically kind of a top-down approach to trying to fix the economy. Essentially, what it did was it gave loans to businesses to try to encourage them not to lay off their workers. The problem with this was that there wasn't enough work to be done because there wasn't enough demand for product. So even if you were getting subsidies to keep your workers employed, you really didn't have anything to get them to do. And so this particular program was really a failure from the very beginning. The other thing that he tries, which is a much more successful program, but it just simply was not large enough, is the Public Works Project program. So basically what you're seeing here is having federal government go out, create these public works projects that would then put people into employment, right? So two examples of these big public works projects that were started under Hoover and then completed under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, is the San Francisco Bay Bridge. This is the bridge that crosses from Oakland to San Francisco across the San Francisco Bay, and then the Hoover Dam, which of course is the massive hydroelectric dam along the Colorado River. So those two projects were started under Hoover. They were completed under FDR. But again, it's just not enough, and it's just not it's not in time either. He waits too long to start a lot of these attempts to try to mitigate the impact of the Depression. And another thing that Hoover does that made a lot of economists very, very nervous is the fact that he signed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, and this happened in 1930. So what does this do? The Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act essentially will raise tariffs on imported goods, so by 40%. The idea was that it was supposed to be a protective tariff, meaning that it would encourage people to buy American-made goods and discourage people from buying, foreign-made goods, because the price of the foreign-made goods would be more expensive because of this high tax. Basically, a tariff is a tax. And this is a huge increase. A 40% increase is very, very big. And what ends up happening as a result of this is that there will be retaliatory tariffs put up against the United States and U.S. made products. So other countries, in sort of retaliation for this high tariff, begin to put up their own high tariffs against American made goods. And so the overall result is a huge drop in the amount of both imports and exports in and out of the U.S. And this is a huge, huge blow to whatever economy was still kind of limping along at the early part of the Great Depression. Hawley-Smoot is really going to put an end to trading and trading partnerships. And you can see on this image, you have over 1,000 economists asking Hoover to veto the tariff bill, obviously recognizing that this was going to be a huge blow to the economy. But he didn't, he signed it, and it does not do what it was intended to do. In fact, it does the opposite. So we're going to look at some images now, and so the federal government is doing very little to respond to the crisis. And in fact, if there was any kind of response to the crisis, it was being done either at the local or the state level. And New York is one example of that. At the time that the Depression breaks out, the governor of New York is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he is one of the few governors in the United States at this time that is trying to work to provide some type of relief to their suffering populations. And so what you're seeing here in the bottom right-hand corner is a photograph of the unemployment relief agency in New York City. And you can see there, people lining up all the way down the street to try to find any kind of employment. These were typically day jobs. So you would just be hired for a day to do some kind of a task. But you can see that people were definitely willing to work. Then you see over in the upper left-hand corner, you see the free coffee and donuts for the unemployed. And again, you've got a long line out the door there. So certain efforts were being made at local, state levels, but very little, again, help, at least initially, from the federal government. Okay, so popping up on the outskirts of major cities throughout the United States during the Great Depression are these little shanty towns that were nicknamed Hoovervilles, obviously after President Hoover. And you can see that they're basically, these are people who either can no longer afford to pay their rent or their mortgage, and they've now become homeless. And so they have no choice but to basically live in these little shacks. And you would see these all over the place throughout the United States. Typically, they were located on the outskirts of major cities, and that was so that the people would still have the ability to go into the city, look for work, etc. So there's also a whole lot of unemployed people, and a lot of them didn't necessarily have any family attachments, or some of them did, but they needed to go out and look for work. And so you see these roving bands of mostly young men riding the freight cars to get from place to place. And it was so bad that, you know, the railroad companies at one point just kind of gave up trying to stop them from doing this, because it wasn't, they didn't have the ability to enforce, you know, people not riding the freight cars. There's just the sheer numbers. This is where you start to see the term hobo and scamp and those types of terms that we know today. We kind of relate it to, you know, people that ride the rails and jump the freight cars, but this was a very common practice back then. So women and children during the Great Depression really had it very, very rough. Prime example of that is the woman that you see pictured there. Her name is Florence Owens, and she was a woman who lost her husband at the beginning of the Great Depression, and he was a farmer in Oklahoma, and there was this huge environmental catastrophe that took place in Oklahoma and surrounding areas called the Dust Bowl, which we will talk about in the next lecture. And basically, she's forced to pick up and leave, and she's got 7 kids. And she comes out to California, and that's where this photograph was taken of her and a couple of her children there. And they basically had to eke out a living, you know, trying to work in farms and things like that in the Central Valley. So this could be especially harsh on women and children. And then, you know, children were expected to basically, you know, try to help feed the family. So children would get sent out, you know, and be told to go and, you know, try to find food, or try to, you know, go out and work and make some money, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so people are really fed up with this situation, and one group of people are the vets, and they are wanting to get a bonus check that they had been promised to get in the 1940s, but they were asking the federal government to give it to them early. And these are World War I veterans, and they basically are seeking early payment of these promised bonuses. So they decide to take their protests to Washington, D.C., and they hold this big demonstration, and they become known as the Bonus Army Marchers. They go to Washington, D.C. When they get to Washington, D.C., they set up their own little Hooverville, basically on the outskirts of the city, and then they take their demonstrations to in front of the Capitol building, in front of the White House, and basically what they're asking for is their bonuses. They are there for about 2 months, until Hoover gets tired of these demonstrations, is embarrassed by them, and he has them forcefully evicted. This is hugely unpopular with the public for obvious reasons. I mean, these are World War I veterans, and they were simply asking for a bonus ahead of time that they had already been promised. So this was huge, and it will eventually lead to Hoover's defeat in the 1932 election. So here you see an image of some bonus Army marchers as they make their way across the country, and you can see they have signs all over their cars, basically trying to promote their cause. And this is what they were met with when they got there, was this sort of forced eviction from this shanty town that they had built on the outskirts of the city. 2 of the bonus marchers will actually be killed as a result of the conflict that ensues from this between the marchers and the military. The president actually ordered out the military to evict them. Okay, so the final thing we're going to talk about today are the bank runs, and this was something that was happening all over the country at this time period. People were started to need money, and they started to go to their banks to try to withdraw their funds, and they found that the bank didn't have their money. So you have this huge rush on the banks. In some cases, there had to be police officers called out to protect the bank buildings because people were trying to bust into them. Banks were shutting left and right. You can see on the slide 5,000 savings and loans, what we now call banks, will fail between 1929 and 1932. And when those banks fail, they take with them all of the money that was in them. So there is no insurance on the banking industry back then. So, you know, if you had a savings account in one of these banks and you were saving for a rainy day and that bank closed, you never saw that money again. So this will create this whole generation of people who don't trust the banks. You know, I remember when I was a kid, sometimes you would hear about, you know, oh, grandma died and they found, you know, $100,000 in her, you know, closet or in the wall of her closet or something like that, because grandma never trusted banks because she lived through the Great Depression. So, and it will take quite some time to restore that trust and that faith in the banking industry. All right, so that's it for today, and this is also the final lecture for this week. Next week we are having spring break, so enjoy the week off, and I will be posting your module work for week 3 sometime over next week. Again, if you have any questions, come to Zoom office hours, email me, or post a question on the discussion board. All right, have a good one. Bye.